So, one of the biggest struggles we often experience as gifted individuals is the tension we often occupy between needing to be recognized for who we really are and the desire to avoid all the ways in which we might be misrecognized or mischaracterized or not fully seen. Because authenticity and integrity tend to be core values of ours, we can experience this tension more dramatically than others. In order to preserve our own relationship with ourselves, with our own sense of authenticity and integrity, a paradoxical result of this is what can be understood as the various ways that gifted adults can end up masking their giftedness. What exactly does it mean to mask our giftedness? Gifted masking can happen more or less consciously or unconsciously. And what it amounts to are basically all the ways in which we end up finding ways to hide or play small in order to fit in or in order to preserve our sense of belonging to like whatever community we're in. And crucially, to preserve our own sense of our relationship with our own authenticity and integrity. That's really crucial, and that's what makes this complex and specific to gifted individuals. So, I'm going to walk you through 7 specific and I feel overlooked ways in which these forms of hiding or self sabotage can show up as masking in gifted adults. And if this already sounds like you and this is resonating, I do want to invite you to check out a quiz that I've developed. It's in the links below, and that's going to lead you through some resources for beginning to work more deeply with your giftedness, your style of giftedness, and identifying specific gifts. And then eventually we're going to go into ways that you can work with developing your gifts, which is the hardest part because this is where we're at. We're dealing with masking, we're dealing with other kinds of internal blocks and resistance to how we can develop our gifts. And what this means is really what everyone deals with, which is how to develop our own potential in life and what we came here to do. And it's just that this is going to show up specifically for gifted adults in particular ways because of that giftedness. So that's what I want to help you guys with. Okay, so there are specifically gifted versions of procrastination, perfectionism, playing small, and they all amount to various types of self-sabotage or masking. Now, we don't usually hear about masking discussed in terms of self-sabotage, so some of these are going to be more or less like overlooked types of masking. This is what I'd call effectively, it's a form of masking. Okay, so the first one, gifted procrastination. This can look like needing more time or taking more time on a decision or a project because you're telling yourself you need to acknowledge the full complexity of this, whatever it is that you're dealing with. Or you feel like you need to do more work to adequately integrate the different variables involved. This is often, this is basically a form of being thorough, which is great. And it really is a gifted flex, but we can use it against ourselves when it becomes a block to just getting something done so we can move on to the next step or the next project. And this is really a complicated form of masking because we're trying to be recognized and not misrecognized. For example, we don't want to be misrecognized for what we perceive as a failure or for work that's like typical or average in the sense of not like on a scale of like superiority, but just because it's not reflecting what we can authentically bring. It's not reflecting our own authentic signature, so to speak. And so that's the sense in which I mean it. And other gifted individuals will totally get this right away. So number 2 is gifted perfectionism. One specifically gifted form of perfectionism is having multiple projects on the go so that kind of subconsciously we're keeping them all in a state of kind of like slowly approaching greatness or something ideal or close to the ideal that we perceive. This isn't like grandiosity. This is just, you know, having some of these gifted traits really does translate into being able to perceive certain ideals and then obviously like wanting to actualize those ideals, which is great. So, but having multiple projects going at the same time can kind of like subconsciously work to let us feel like that we're still approaching this ideal rather than like just pulling the trigger and getting something done. And of course, getting something done and having it sit out there in the world obviously opens it up and opens us up to all kinds of potential criticism and judgment. So, this is a form of gifted masking, I would say, because working on a variety of projects really lets us indulge our self-image of either like having multiple gifts, like working on multiple dimensions and aspects of who we are, or making something highly innovative or complex, all while being able to avoid judgment, particularly the possibility that the final product or outcome isn't really all that special in the way that we had initially imagined, and definitely not exceptional, and definitely maybe doesn't really live up to the ideal that we originally saw, which could convey our own authentic relationship to what we were contributing. And in so doing, it doesn't reflect the best of our own potential. So again, this can apply to everyone and anyone, but this shows up particularly in this way for gifted adults. Okay, and number 3 is what I'd call hedging on our goals. Now, this one's the most complex of all 7 that I'm going to talk about. This one is a bit of a fusion or combination of the first 2 strategies we just talked about, because what this is about is really hedging on your dreams in the first place. So this draws on underlying feelings or assumptions about one's self-worth, and these may be deeply stored implicit beliefs about not being able to like directly go after what you want. And maybe this is as deep as not even being able to fully imagine the full vision of what you want, because you can't even get there yet. You can't bring the energy, or you just don't have, you just know that you're energetically not there yet. You can't access that part of yourself yet. And so what we do is we can unconsciously conjure up something smaller that maybe feels more realistic or believable, and it's still authentic and it's still part of our authentic path, but we aim for it because that's what we have access to. That's the best we can imagine right now. That's the most believable, and it's still authentic, which is important. Now, one of the ways that this can show up in practice is that in order to protect your dream, or we might say to mask it effectively, is to shield it and to shield yourself from potential judgment, but in a way that still lets you show up authentically. And you might even start taking on an additional, smaller, or maybe more socially acceptable version of your big goal or plan or project. And it's still authentic because it's still moving you authentically forward, but it's the smaller or sort of like more indirect step forward. And we may actually do something similar for many reasons, many kinds of reasons. For example, like protecting the energy around our goals and plans. But the specifically gifted version of this is that your brain will keep coming up with like some smaller or additional piece that you have to do first in order for the rest to work or make sense, or because now you know you need this one other piece. And it's kind of like if you're writing a project and maybe you just start in the middle with your argument, and then you realize, then only after you know what you're actually going to say and the argument you're making, only then does it really make sense to write your introduction, as we know. But what can happen is then that you find now you actually need an introduction to the introduction, so to speak. So if you're a writer, you totally know what I mean by this. But more generally, I think this can happen for gifted adults with any type of project that we're undertaking. We end up finding like that one more piece we need in order for us to do the main thing. Or this could show up as like, instead of simplifying your original idea or your original goal so that you can get it done, which is the point, right? That's why it's a goal. So instead of simplifying that, your brain might come up with what feels like something else, which is even simpler, And maybe that's also in part to preserve your own relationship with complexity, because that's where your authenticity feels at home. So let me know if this one makes sense to you. This is the most complex of the 7 ways that I want to talk about masking in gifted adults. The next 4 are definitely pretty straightforward, but let me know in the comments if this one resonates with you or if you experience something similar. So the next 4 common but overlooked forms of gifted masking involve 2 of these are what I would call like forms of conversational hedging, and 2 are just some uniquely gifted forms of self-sabotage that gifted adults are prone to experience. So number 4, we've got conversational hedging, suppression. So this one is about straight up suppressing what we fear makes us different or would make us misrecognized, mischaracterized, misunderstood. And often these are things for the gifted individual, these are things like knowing additional information, knowing more about the context, knowing more connections between one topic and another one, and our natural tendency to ask a lot of questions or ask more pointed questions because we have like higher levels of curiosity or an ability to display care and concern. And many people have really like dimmed or suppressed this in themselves. So some of it just makes them uncomfortable when they encounter it. And we gradually or implicitly learn to absorb that suppression because we don't like feeling like we're being treated as weird or naive or just ignored as part and parcel of somebody else's own internal discomfort. So really broadly, this is basically how socialization works in general for everyone. But in the case of gifted adults, it also specifically involves dimming our gifted light, so to speak, the things we know about, so that we can more effectively move through social settings. And a great example here from my own life, when I was like 18 or 19, I had my astrological chart read out on the West Coast, and the astrologer told me something like, just after a few glances, he told me something like, you bring more to a situation than is required. And I was only 18 or 19 then. That's after already several years of like learning where and when to start dimming my light, so to speak. So that's just incredibly like insightful, I find. And it's a great example illustrating this kind of suppression technique and what we learn to do to kind of like stay socially adaptive, so to speak. Okay, moving on. We've got conversational hedging, and now this one's about modulating. So this is a less extreme, but it's a distinct variation of what we just talked about. So here we're not outright suppressing who we are, but we're doing something closer to translating. And this is so that we can be sure that we are making sense and fitting in. So rather than using the words or expressions or descriptions, for example, that like might come most naturally and authentic to us, that have an authentic feeling relationship to what we're feeling or how we're feeling, we know, for example, that maybe this would come in with like too many other weird connotations for someone, or maybe it's just like too complex for what the situation requires, as it were. And we know this, and we know it wouldn't be easily perceived. So we choose answers and statements maybe that basically like sound less complex or they're less creative ultimately, and because it makes more obvious sense. So this is a tricky one to describe because we have to remember that this is not a case of inauthenticity. It's not a form of lying. It's not a form of intentional deception or anything like that. But you can hardly blame like the gifted person or the neurodivergent person for this, right? I mean, think about it. And it's also reminding me of what's known as code switching, which is experienced by anyone who really needs to interface with another cultural group that is not like their home cultural group. And this is also not a case of inauthenticity. It's like an evolved form of like reading the room. You obviously know that certain things just don't work in a certain context. So it's not really the same as a form of people pleasing or inauthenticity. It's really a highly socially adaptive mechanism, for better or for worse. And a really good example here of how this can show up specifically for gifted individuals is if we take the example of like writing those multiple choice tests that we did in elementary and secondary school. Now, you probably remember this from the tests that you took, but basically, you would read the answers themselves and we would basically see more information than was needed to answer the question. We would see more information in the question and the way it was asked, and we remember more of the background details that are informing the various contexts that would inform the types of statements that we're looking at. So it's already potentially highly more complex than it should be for really paradoxical reasons. So, for example, we might see why two or more answers are true depending on what areas are being looked at or emphasized. And of course, the question itself is always underdetermined because whoever was writing it was likely not even thinking about those other contexts or options. And so the wording is underdetermined and it's really kind of like feeling quite one-dimensional. And we're basically just supposed to stick with the context that we can tell it was written in. And this is fine because most gifted people probably are already tracking that. And then in most cases, it's no difficult. Like you can understand the context that the person's coming from and you can see what the right answer is supposed to be, which is often true anyway, but it's just there's always one other one that would have been like just as true, but But there's also like a ton of situations, obviously, later in life that are kind of just like this in many conversational contexts that are really highly underdetermined. And, maybe most of these, and definitely in some cases, these are like painfully underdetermined. And a multidimensional mind needs to make some hard calculations between like authenticity and not between inauthenticity, because we're not really going there, but it's more about like how much authenticity can like I let flow through here. It's like what level of complexity, what depth of focus am I able to like bring into this situation and at what social cost? Now, if these last two forms of masking really resonate with you, and especially the next one that I'm going to talk about, I want to invite you to my free email course on developing a healthy sense of self-validation. It's going to get you started on working through fears of anticipated criticism and judgment, as well as like general issues around feeling like we don't fit in or feeling like you don't belong, even in a place where objectively you belong. So you can get started on this right away in the links below. And, let me know how you do. There's some homework exercises in here, and then we can keep talking about that, and I can keep supporting you through that part of the journey. Okay, moving on. So now we've got number 6. We are now talking about gifted forms of self-sabotage. The first one. This is our attachment and aversion to the idea that we're different. This is almost the essence of the authenticity dilemma because we are different, but we want to be seen correctly in our uniqueness. And again, this is true for everyone. But what happens is the way that we can sink back into a default assumption like, well, no one can or would really understand. No one will really understand this or will really understand me. This is meant to protect our self-image from weird forms of judgment because some of them are really weird. But also it can obviously like hold us back. And it can even come across as like arrogant or elitist. But again, you can't really blame like neurocomplex people because it is so true that we can attract like confusion or judgment in others. And of course, it is actually socially adaptive to find ways to avoid that. So this is just part of the unique path of authentic individuation that gifted adults will go through. Okay, moving on. Now we've got gifted form of self-sabotage, number 2. This is the last form of masking that I want to talk about here, and I think it can actually show up also specifically in ADHD and autism to some extent, although for all of these, it does have different reasons and motivations and appearances. So in giftedness, what we're often dealing with is that because we have the ability to so easily or readily absorb new information and knowledge, distilling new forms of knowledge, and we're also predisposed to seek out the edges of our understanding, which translates into moving towards complexity and novelty. So, because of this, we kind of have a tendency to not want to do the same thing more than once we've mastered it. So, whether this is like reading an article, studying a specific subject, developing a new skill, stepping out of our comfort zone, once we tend to we get the gist, we get the essence really quickly, we don't need to see 10 examples illustrating the theory once we understand the theory. Oh my God. That can be so frustrating, and it can really slow gifted individuals down. Like, I have been there myself. We don't need to see 10 proofs once we've understood one proof. And so this can seem like an obvious strength in the cases where it is a strength, but it's also a really easy way to self-sabotage ourselves as gifted individuals. And it can keep us staying small because some paths really do need us to commit to certain forms of repetition in order to actually make progress. So you may need to keep repeating something that you've already learned, and to understand that the repetition itself doesn't mean that you haven't learned it. It doesn't mean that you haven't mastered it. And one of the ways I taught myself this was by watching, like concert pianists in practice, or by profession, when you think about it. Someone playing like a Rachmaninoff concerto, like, you don't think they've practiced that and played it like hundreds of times? So when things become a practice, it's kind of like moving knowledge into a different domain, because it's not about your understanding. It's about, are you able to still embody this? It's a form of embodiment. And so the challenge with gifted adults is to learn to not code that as kind of like boredom or a waste. So you do have to know what you're actually committed to and what you're dedicated to in order to bring forms of understanding into a practice that you want to continue embodying. Now, this is different from ADHD because moving on to a new domain or seeking new areas for mastery is not here a form of distraction, but again, it's more about seeking the edges of our understanding, pushing ourselves into greater relationships with complexity and nuance. So it's not like a failure of executive function, but you can still see this as an area for development or an area for learning, again, as I said, how to like continue a practice of mastery over the long term. So beyond just the point where you're like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, I don't need more examples. I get it. But now what am I going to actually put into practice and embody? And for gifted individuals too, there's even a fear around the idea that we've stopped learning and therefore we've stopped growing or developing. And the trick here is really to learn that development can also come through these long-term processes and practices of repetition that are literally forms of discipline, but also, again, more deeply, as I said, it's a form of embodiment and a form of commitment once you have found what you're committed to and what you're really here to contribute. So in that sense, we can cultivate and develop our knowledge and understanding in a very specific way that can actualize projects here in the 3D. So let me know how this tracks for you in your own experience, and if you experience yourself somewhere on this spectrum of focus for learning. For example, across ADHD, and then maybe into more like tunneled or deep dive focus types of focus in autism. So, for example, is giftedness a kind of agility between these, retaining focus for as long as we need to in order to understand or master something, master a certain area, but then wanting to move on really quickly so we continue that experience of learning? Is this a spectrum? What do you think? And of course, also let me know which of these 7 types of masking like resonates most for you, or if there's another really big one that you experienced that you would add to this list. And of course, remember, many of these do apply in a general sense to anyone and everyone, but they will show up in a specifically gifted type of presentation in gifted adults, which makes them a form of gifted masking. And again, I really want to invite you all to check out and grab a special set of resources that I've developed for those who are either new or newly exploring your gifted identity. And I've got a quiz in the links below, which is going to help guide you through the process of learning your types of giftedness and then going deeper with the specific individual gifts that you're here to develop. And then, of course, we're going to work together to learn actually how to develop these gifts so that you're actually living your potential and not just feeling stuck or blocked or caught by one of these types of forms of like masking your giftedness. So get started on that quiz in the links below, and I'll see you in the comments.